All right, once again, good afternoon, everyone. I am JT Dean, Director of Individual Giving and Major Gifts at Chesapeake Conservancy. We're so glad to have you today to talk about our post-election conservation policy work that we're doing. This is part of our Chesapeake Conservancy webinar series we're doing to highlight aspects of the work that we're doing, but also some interesting things that you are going to love and care about around the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed, whether it's places, it's policy, or any current events that we are working on here. So I hope you can if you join us for other ones. I hope you had a great time, and I hope you can join us for future webinars that we're going to have in the future. But today, obviously, we are talking about post-election conservation policy. Just give an overview of the Chesapeake Conservancy for those who may not be familiar with us. We work throughout the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, from New York down through Virginia, work in every state, working on land conservation with data science and collaborative opportunities. We do stream restoration and also work with just mapping and data and sharing that data, making sure that it is accessible to everyone so everyone can be more empowered to do the work that we're doing. Our goals are to conserve 30% of the Chesapeake Bay watershed by 2030 to enhance biodiversity, making sure everyone has equitable access to the bay and to the outdoors, and to preserve the special places around the watershed that we care about, historical, ecological, or otherwise. So obviously today we're talking about the post-election, and as many of you are going through the election and just kind of looking at to see what's going to happen in the future, we get a lot of questions around here about what's going to happen. And those are valid questions, and working through them, and hopefully today you can at least get some sense of where we're going for the Conservancy and where conservation in the Chesapeake Bay is headed. We have a lot of opportunities, not just in the future, but also with the remainder of the session. We are a bipartisan organization, so we'll work with anybody who cares about protecting our lands, our waters, and our historical environmental sites around the watershed. So we're excited to move forward. We're at a point of transition, not just for the country, but in the Conservancy. Some of you may have seen the note that our president and CEO, Joel Dunn, is leaving the Conservancy after 14 years. And so we'll be transitioning into new leadership, and we've started the search process already, and we'll have someone lined up hopefully in June. But I think the transition that we're going through is the Conservancy and the country is a good metaphor to work together, because regardless of whoever is leading the country, the organization, conservation stays the same. Our goals will not change. We are working to protect these places because they're so valuable to our country, to the region, for the environment, for social justice, everything that we deal with here as a country and as a society really comes under conservation, because what brings us all together is the land that we have here. That's the one thing in this country that we all share together. And so we're going to power forward. We're moving ahead regardless of whoever's in charge. And so we're excited to see the future. We have a lot of great things coming up, but we are excited first just to share with you some of the work that we're doing here on the policy side of things. So I want to introduce our speakers for today, who will be sharing their expertise. First, we have Dan Sakura of Sakura Conservation Strategies. He advises nonprofit clients to help them achieve their conservation and historic preservation goals. He has over 30 years of conservation experience, including designating nationally significant historical sites, such as the Captain John Smith Trail, Springfield, Illinois, 1908 Race Riot National Monument, and the Amachi National Historic Site. Our next speaker is Executive Vice President of External Affairs here at Chesapeake Conservancy, Mark Conway. He oversees the organization's activities in the areas of government relations and community support, working closely with our president and CEO and board of directors to provide strategic direction and help the team to accomplish the organization's overall mission. Mark is also a Baltimore City Council member of District 4, but you should know that Mark is speaking today in his capacity as the Executive Vice President for the Chesapeake Conservancy. If you have any questions regarding Baltimore City, Baltimore policy, I'll refer you to his official office so he can answer some of those questions for you. So we'll be going through some of the information we have here in our panel discussion this afternoon. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will address those afterwards. So let me first move forward here. So like I said, with the change in administration, we still have work to do. There's a lot of things that are happening in the next 2 months, or I guess less than 2 months now before new Congress takes over, including with the Chesapeake National Recreation Area bill. So to get into more detail, I'm going to pass it over to Mark. Could you give us some information on what the CNRA is?
Absolutely. Thanks, JT. I think you keyed it up very nicely. So I would imagine a lot of folks listening in today are familiar with the CNRA, but um, nevertheless, the CNRA is an effort that we've been looking at in the Chesapeake for quite some time. And what it does is it acknowledges the Chesapeake Bay and a series of parks throughout the Chesapeake Bay as a part of the national park system. We know the treasure that Chesapeake Bay is. We know how valuable it is to our communities throughout the bay, but also throughout the watershed. And what this will do is make it part of the National Park Service, allow them to help with the branding and the coordination and making sure that we can really speak to a strategic message across the Chesapeake Bay. In the bill that was presented by Senator Van Hollen, there are going to be four sites within the bay, within the in the bill. The first being Whitehall Manor. Um, so this is a historic site, beautiful, beautiful site that gives a great view of the bay, and has a lot of history about um, you know in slavery and other pieces, long, complicated history, which I think is really important to tell about the bay and about the future, about how we talk about it. Second is Burtis House. Burtis House is the last standing waterman's house within in Annapolis, and really has a long history, of course, with watermen on the bay, and it is an awesome site, really in the heart of Annapolis, that I think will be very accessible to folks, but also tell a really important story about watermen and how it started and how it continues to be a really big, important part of the history of the Chesapeake Bay. Um, Next, we've got Thomas Point Lighthouse, which I know we've all seen photos of this gorgeous lighthouse, and it's iconic imagery. This is one of those great photos. I'm looking at it now, but of course has a lot of history, and I think really provides an opportunity for folks to see the bay from a pretty unique perspective. And then finally, Fort Monroe, located in Virginia, um, of course, has a lot of military connections and otherwise, but also gives a very unique outlook on the bay from the southern part of the bay within Virginia. So, this is going to be these are the sites that are initially part of the bill. The bill does allow for additional sites into the future. So this is the start. This is not the finish, but an incredibly important big, big, big giant leap. I was going to call it a first step, but a really big and giant leap for the Chesapeake Bay, and our partnership with the National Park Service, which has served us so well under the Gateways program.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. And this legislation was first introduced, excuse me, earlier in the session, as you mentioned, by Senator Van Hollen and Representative John Sarbanes in the House. It's the furthest this bill has ever gone. For an update on where it is and the status of it, I want to pass it over to Dan to give us where we are, where we stand with the legislation. So, Dan?
Great. Great, JT. Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge some key partners. I know there are many people, but Peter Marks with Choose Clean Water, thank you for joining and all your hard work. Also, Pam Goddard with National Parks Conservation Association. But we'd especially like to acknowledge the leadership and vision of Senator Van Hollen and Congressman Sarbanes, who have introduced bipartisan bills in the House and Senate. As Mark mentioned, both bills authorize the Park Service to acquire land for the CNRA to be owned by the Park Service, but only through donation or voluntary sale. So this is a landowner-driven process and is respecting of private property rights and municipal governments that own some of this property. So that's really key. Second is it permanently reauthorizes the Chesapeake Bay Gateways program and removes the authorization funding ceiling that had been a block for the program to to achieve its full potential. So those are two really critical things. The other piece of this is it authorizes Park Service to acquire up to 10 acres for visitor contact or visitor services sites, which would help the public better understand and appreciate the Bay. The conservation, JT, as you mentioned, is bipartisan. We are incredibly grateful on the House side for the support of Congressman Rob Whitman and Jen Kiggins, who are Republicans from Virginia, key supporters and co-sponsors of the House bill. Thanks to some remarkable work by the staff of Senator Van Hollen and Senator Sarbanes, just this week on Tuesday, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee approved the CNRA bill, the Senate bill S-2620, via voice vote, which is a unanimous vote of the committee, which shows really the hard work and the thought that's gone into the bill. And it had support from both the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee. And we are very eager to work with Senator Van Hollen and Congressman Sarbanes' staff to include the CNRA bill into what is called a lands package. And this lands package would include bills very similar to the CNRA, bills that have gone through a public process, bills with community support. And there's a really good collection of both Democratic and Republican bills that are bipartisan that we hope will be included in a bipartisan lands package. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we are now, Congress is leaving for the Thanksgiving recess and will be coming back in December for 3-week lame duck session. And the biggest bill at the station, it's like a train at the station, is the annual must-pass National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, which authorizes the Department of Defense and other agencies. And we are hopeful that the lands package could potentially be included on the NDAA. There's a couple other bills. The second is appropriations. The continuing resolution runs through December 20th and will need to be extended, most likely by what's called a continuing resolution into 2025, so March of 2025, into the next Congress, which, as folks know, would be Republican controlled in both the Senate and the House. Also, there's President submitted a proposal for disaster funding that may or may not be considered this year as part of the appropriations process. And lastly, the Farm Bill is authorized through the end of the year, but will likely be extended into next Congress.
Thanks, Dan. I know you have a lot going on. Dan's joining us we're in the middle of a lot of Hill visits today. So as soon as we log off, he's jumping on with more visits, trying to get this important work done. So thank you, Dan, for all your help with it. Now, this doesn't have to do with legislation necessarily, but it does have to do with government relations and some big conservation work that we're in the process of doing. That's in regards to the Southern Maryland Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge, at least the proposed Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge. So Mark, could you tell the folks a little more about the refuge, its goals, and what we hope to see from it?
Yeah. So this is another really big and important effort in partnership with and really the leadership of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the Southern Maryland Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge, I know it's a mouthful, but bear with me, will really help us to conserve lands within Southern Maryland. So what it would do is it would allow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conserve up to at least initially 40,000 acres within the boundaries, and the boundaries really span over 500,000 acres. And it's really focused on land and focused on woodlands and forests and grasslands within the area. We know that there are a lot of endangered species and really species that need protection in these areas. And so this is going to prove to be a pretty useful tool in making sure we protect the ecologies in the area and also really help us toward our efforts now in Maryland. And we'll get to this a little bit going past 30 by 30, but going to 40 by 40. So really excited about this effort, really excited to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and getting it established and then helping to identify lands that make sense to conserve.
And for the approval process, could you give us an overview of what needs to happen for this to be formalized?
Yeah, so a big part of this is already done. This is not legislation. This is something that is determined at U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And once they go through their administrative process, it really becomes official once we actually start conserving land. And so we are actively working to conserve the first piece of land. We hope that we'll be able to do that early next year, or maybe even by the end of this year. And so this is going to be a pretty unique opportunity for us to get this kicked off and begin using this as a tool to conserve valuable lands within the state of Maryland.
And I forget if you mentioned this, but we could potentially conserve up to 40,000 acres in southern Maryland, the first new wildlife refuge in Maryland since 1962. So this could be an amazing conservation tool for Maryland, for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, and hopefully be able to be mirrored in other states in the future.
Yeah. So you said it 100% right. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife will have the ability to conserve 40,000 acres. But this span that you're looking at here is a little over 500,000 acres for which they can do the work within a sort of southern Maryland area. And so this is, I think, a real opportunity for us to be thoughtful and to really get a lot of this conservation work done in areas that need it most.
Yeah. And Mark, you brought up a good point. Let's add a little context to this map that we're seeing here. This isn't the official refuge, correct? This is the acquisition boundary.
This is the acquisition boundary. That's correct. So the refuge will be the lands that U.S. Fish and Wildlife acquires through purchase or donation. And they can acquire within these areas. So this is essentially telling us where they can acquire lands within. And this is determined by really, where we see the most value and the opportunity for conservation having the highest value. But this is the acquisition boundary, to be clear. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks. All right. Well, going back to the federal side of things, I want to bring Dan back into the conversation. And this is what I think a lot of people have questions about, is what to look forward to on the federal side over the next year, the next few years. I want to see, Dan, what are your thoughts on what things we should look forward to and opportunities that might arise?
Yeah, so JT, thank you so much. So first off, we are looking at new members elected to Congress in the Bay watershed, and in Maryland, we're looking forward to working closely with Senator-elect Angela Alsobrooks, also Representatives-elect Sarah Elfreth, Johnny O, and in Western Maryland, April McLean Delaney, who is representing the area around Frederick. There are also members sort of outside of Maryland in Virginia, Eugene Vindman and Suhas Subramanian, who is in the House side, and then new senators in Delaware and West Virginia. The other thing we are looking at with the Senate changing from Democrat to Republican next Congress, we are looking at new committee leadership. My focus is primarily on the Senate Energy and the authorizing committees for the national parks, which is considering the CNRA. The Senate Chairman Manchin of West Virginia is retiring, and U.S. Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, will be the next chair of the Senate Energy Committee. And Senator Martin Heinrich, Democrat of New Mexico, will be the ranking member of that committee. There's numerous other committees that touch the Bay, including the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate, the Agriculture Committees, and we're so glad that Peter Marks is part of this team who can has a much deeper knowledge in this. So I encourage folks to reach out to Peter if they have any questions about some of the committee leadership. What we'll see early next year in January, when the new House, when the new House and Senate members are sworn in, we will see new committee assignments, leadership announcements, and most importantly, Senate confirmation hearings. President-elect Trump has indicated he will officially nominate Doug Burgum of North Dakota to serve as the Secretary of the Interior, as well as the Energy Czar. And we will, after President Trump is sworn in, he can officially transmit those nominations. So far, we haven't seen about Agriculture Secretary, which would have a key impact on some of those Farm Bill programs. And then we would likely see nominations for some of the sub-cabinet positions, assistant secretaries for Interior, Agriculture, et cetera, undersecretaries, as well as the directors of the bureaus, Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So those will need to go through both the Senate Energy and the Senate Environment and Public Works committees. And those are excellent opportunities to highlight, for groups to highlight their work through their elected officials talking to the nominees. Obviously, the biggest thing that on the horizon that we are very concerned about are proposals to cut the federal workforce. Having worked in conservation, conservation can only be accomplished with the incredibly dedicated, hardworking, knowledgeable career staff for the resource agencies at the federal level. Obviously, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Forest Service, NRCS, the entire EPA, all the federal agencies. And those folks are really the they drive conservation and all the things that we care about. So, preserving that federal workforce that as a motivated team is going to be, really critical. And we're hopeful that, the agencies that have a lot of support in the public that we work with are not subject to some of these really harmful proposed cuts. But on the bright side, I would add that, the work that the Conservancy does with its partners and with its federal and state agencies and other municipal partners, there's such bipartisan support for this work. And even, during the first Trump administration, there was strong support to pass the John Dingell Act, which in 2019, which was signed into law. And that was one of the biggest park bills and public land bills in recent memory. The Great American Outdoors Act was signed into law in 2020 to permanently reauthorize the Land and Water Conservation Fund and to create funding for deferred maintenance. So, there is. I'm a backcountry skier, and I have a saying, don't look at the trees, look at the spaces in between the trees. And I see, spaces to maneuver going forward on conservation, that enjoys community support and bipartisan support.
Thanks, Dan. Mark, you and your teams have worked closely with a lot of these federal partners, state partners. Could you give a little more context around the work that we're doing within the collaboration?
Sorry, you said state partners?
Like more on the federal side of things. Like when we're working with the Chesapeake Bay program, what does that work look like in reference to Dan's comments regarding proposed cuts to those agencies?
Yeah, I think probably the most important piece for us is to have a united message. We have a number of other partners, Choose Clean Water Coalition, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and many others who are helping us to have a united message on the Bay. Like, what do we need in order to be, continue to be effective? I think we've made some significant progress, certainly on the waterfront, but then also in our lands in conservation efforts. And I think we want to make sure that we don't lose that steam. And so It's been for my team really an effort in coordinating that message across our states and having those states roll that up to the federal government so that we continue to see sufficient funding, but then also have a united message on what we're trying to accomplish, all together. So,
Thanks.
yeah.
And the transition more to the stateside, Mark. I know that you've been running around working in different state houses and our coalition
Yeah.
partners, where we've had a lot of success and a lot of bipartisan collaboration, in particular with Pennsylvania. And I just want to thank you to all the folks who are joining us from Pennsylvania, where we've had a lot of success this past year. But Mark, can you tell a little bit what we're looking forward to in I guess, the next sessions for states and commonwealths?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've really been trying to do in this last year at the Conservancy is really expand our efforts. We've had a lot of success in Maryland, and specifically learning from what other states are doing. So in Maryland, this past session, we were able to pass the whole Watershed Act, which took from some of the lessons that we learned from our work in Pennsylvania, and essentially in some ways copied and pasted that effort into Maryland and found a way to pilot a stream delisting approach that has been extremely successful in Pennsylvania, and pilot that in Maryland. So we're now helping to stand that up here in Maryland, and really, really proud of the work that we've done in Pennsylvania, and we like to replicate that in Maryland. We were also, able to protect some of the work that we'd already accomplished in the last term. So in the last term, there were proposals to tap into program open space protected land, where funds from the program open space fund were used to protect land and open that up to solar development. We were able to bat back some of those efforts after some pretty robust push it from pretty powerful people at the state level. And we're going to continue to see that pressure from the solar side of things. This term, this upcoming session, one of the focuses that we have is on solar siting and making sure that knowing we want to see more solar across the state, knowing we definitely need more clean energy, we just want to make sure that we put those in places that make sense. Of course, brownfields, of course, developed areas, and places where we're not affecting ecosystems and forests in land that is really important toward conservation. So that's going to be one of our major focuses in Maryland going into the next session. Also, we know that Maryland is dealing with some significant budget concerns. They're projecting right now a $2.7 billion budget deficit going into this next year, which is one of the largest that they've seen in over a decade. And we know that that's going to put pressures on some of the conservation funding that we see out of program open space and from some of our other environmental funds. And so, one of the focuses that we have, and I've been working, literally just having this conversation before we had this webinar, is to make sure that funding is protected or not hit so hard that it sets us back in some of the efforts that we've been able to make some significant progress. Maryland is actually one of the only state that has actually crossed the threshold of a 30% conservation rate thus far. So really, really proud of the work that they have been able to make thus far. And we want to keep that effort going forward. So Pennsylvania, I talked a little bit about some of the efforts that we have already been doing for a number of years around stream delisting. And Pennsylvania actually rolled out a pretty robust program continuing to support those efforts. And so many of our efforts going forward in this coming session will be to continue to push for appropriations for these stream delisting efforts. I think it's proved incredibly helpful for farmers and for some of the property owners that are along our streams that are able to implement some of these best practices in order to reduce effluent going into the streams and rivers. And so, really working with Pennsylvania to continue that effort. And in Virginia, we've been really trying to pick up our efforts. Virginia has been probably one of the most, if not in some ways, the most important partners in some of the waterfront work that we've been doing. One of the big things that we've been working on in Virginia is sustaining permanent funding for conservation. Right now, every dollar that we get for conservation in Pennsylvania, we've got to fight for. Whereas in other states like Maryland, We have funds like Program Open Space, where we've got reliable funding sources that can consistently help us to protect more and more land. Virginia, I think, let me check my numbers here. Today, Virginia has conserved about 21% of the watershed within Virginia, which is great, but it's a very large state, and we still have created a great deal of work to do. So having sustainable funding, having consistent funding for conservation will go a long way towards helping us to get there. What we know by way of our data on what funding helps us to conserve land is that the states probably have the most important impact in that land conservation effort. Maryland has been a case in point in that, and certainly Virginia has as well. But Virginia being a much larger state, we're going to need more money and more sustainable funding in order to do so. The other piece I think in Virginia that I think we're trying to float out there, Maryland has committed to 30% by 2030. Maryland has already met that 30% mark. Maryland has also committed to 40% by 2040, and they are now endeavoring upon that mark after passing the 30% mark. Virginia has not yet set a conservation goal, and so we are trying to work with folks within Virginia to figure out what that goal is, what pace we want to do it at, and what is reasonable and feasible in Virginia, and how to get consistent political support to see it through as a goal for all folks to work toward. So yeah, we've been pretty busy in the States, and I'm excited about the expansion of the work that we've been doing on the policy front, realizing that this policy conversation, especially some of the stuff that we're talking about here, these are where we're seeing a lot of the biggest wins that we're seeing across the Chesapeake. And when we talk about the sustainability of our work, it's really through policy that we're able to see these long-term benefits. And so looking forward to the next session.
Thanks, Mark. I want to first note for our audience here, if you have any questions, we'll go into the Q&A session in a little bit. You can go to the question and answer tab and put in your question. We'll address that in a few minutes. But Mark, I want to go back to something that you mentioned regarding solar siting. I know that's a big conversation, as you mentioned, in Maryland and Virginia. This isn't a GIS data science webinar, but I think it would be useful to, if you could highlight some of the work that we're doing at the Conservancy when it regards to solar and how that data dictates policy, we're hoping can dictate policy in the future.
Yeah. So one, what you don't know, you can't really change. And so one of the big things that we do is we are actually we're tracing where these solar panels are going. We are seeing a significant boom, especially in Virginia, in new solar. And interestingly, our CIC has been using AI to predict where we might expect more solar to go. And we're seeing that rate pick up dramatically in just the last year or two, as we see a couple of things happen in Virginia, and we expect these things will happen in Maryland too. We're seeing significantly more data centers, which I won't go down that rabbit hole, but that is a significant concern, I think, for conservation and balancing the need on water and the need on land in order to meet those data center needs. But those data centers also need a ton of power. And so between mapping those data centers and mapping the solar panels that then feed power to those data centers, and then also mapping the routes, the electrical routes for where we have to lay down these wires in order to serve the grid and serve these areas, it's a pretty robust effort and also a significant impact on land. We were at the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership annual meeting yesterday, actually. And one of the things that I did not know, but was pretty shocking to me, is that in the next 10 to 15 years, at least in Virginia, solar is on pace to overpower all new development. So there will be more solar in Virginia than there will be developed land. That's the pace at which we're moving. This is happening really, really, really fast. And on one hand, that's great to see that solar is really going to boom. On the other hand, we don't want to move so fast that we break so many things, and then we look back and realize that we mowed down literally forests, and took out species in part because we wanted to see solar. So there's that balance that really our CIC team has been really thoughtful looking at trends for endangered species and species migration and things like that that will be really, really important in determining what makes sense by where it makes sense to put these solar panels and where it makes sense to put these electrical lines. So that's going to be really invaluable going into the future when we think about policy recommendations at the state level.
Great, thanks. All right, we're gonna transition to our question and answer session. Just to start things off, Dan, a lot of people are out there asking, like, what can we do moving forward? With some new members of Congress and the Senate coming in, how can they be talking to their representative, either on the state, local levels, on the need for conservation policy?
Yeah, I think we've got new members of Congress that are some of whom are very familiar with the Bay and very supportive of this effort. Some of them, come from different backgrounds. So, next year there will be opportunities for annual fly-ins. I know that Choose Clean Water has a fly-in that's really helpful. Talking to members about hopefully we can get the CNRA bill enacted this year. If not, next year we'll want to talk to members about passing CNRA and other important bills that are currently pending in Congress. But be engaged. Come to Washington, meet with your members when the members are home in their districts. Talk to them. Invite them to your specific project areas, like your ribbon cuttings, or just show them what you're doing and how important, how much public support there is for this critical conservation work.
Thanks, Mark. So Mark, when you're talking with representatives on the state level, what are you hearing from them in regards to their dedication and commitment to conservation? And I guess more address it from the bipartisan approach that some of these members are taking.
Yeah, that's a great question because it does depend on each member. I will say we certainly have our allies and are very strong allies, folks that are going to stand by us through thick and thin. I would say there are many others that generally support some of our work, but are trying to be more practical. And so I think, in our conversations, when we're talking about conserving more land or being more strategic about where solar goes or things like that, these are actually really tough conversations to have. I'll tell you, I've had a couple of conversations with legislators that are just, they want all guns blazing. Let's put as much solar out there as we possibly can, regardless of where it happens. And so I think we've got to get ahead of that. I am worried about that as a future sort of broad effort. While I think we all agree we need more solar. I think we all agree that we need more clean energy, and I think we need to be able to make a very strong case for why conservation can't be forgotten in those efforts, because it doesn't always connect with every member. And while we may have our individual members who get it and are fully supportive of our efforts and think about the bigger question about ecosystems and protecting source waters and endangered species and recreation and all the things that we truly and strongly advocate for, the things we believe in, not every member of each of these state, legislations, they're not necessarily going to see things from that same perspective. And so we're going to have to make the argument in no uncertain terms and be prepared for folks that maybe don't necessarily care, but if we can speak to some of the practical and economic impacts as well, I think that'll also be pretty convincing.
Thanks. So to go to our questions from our attendees, first one, will the increased need for climate change related disaster relief funds, in particular, with a great example here we have from the hurricane in Western North Carolina, will that impact what's available for conservation efforts? Dan, do you want to address that?
Sure. My Wi-Fi is a little bit uh, off right now, but I
Yep.
We lost him
Looks like we
there.
lost Dan.
Mark, do you want to take that?
I can try, but I think
Yeah.
Dan is far more qualified to answer that question. Oh, there he goes. Dan, save me.
sorry about that. The disaster supplemental, I believe, I haven't looked at it, but includes funding for some of the agencies that were impacted. But I don't expect it to directly impact the regular conservation funding programs. So,
Great. So going to our next question, where do you see the future of funded, where do you see the future of funded pattern tile projects in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia going in the next 2 to 3 years? Feel free to jump in there, Mark or Dan.
The question is, what do we expect by way of federal funding?
Future of where do you see the future of funded pattern tile projects?
Pattern tile. I'm not sure that I understand what a pattern tile project
Okay.
is. If I can, I'll speak more
Sure.
broadly.
Mhm.
I'll interpret it as federal funding for environmental efforts. It's hard to say. I think with the incoming administration and some of the ways that they've taken Bay-wide efforts in the past, there's a good chance that they'll at least make an action towards making cuts or not making increases. I think we have to be prepared for that from the federal level. Um, I do believe there is a glimmer of hope that this being a bipartisan effort, if we are able to make a very strong and compelling case that is appealing to this administration and the incoming party representation from the House and Senate, that we can make a case that doesn't result in as large of a cut. But I think there's a pretty good chance that this we're gonna see we're gonna have to make some pretty strong arguments going into this coming administration.
Yeah, JT, if I could just add a couple things. One is Peter Marks shared that the Choose Clean Water Coalition Lobby Day is March 5th. And Peter does a real excellent job, and his team, very organized, great opportunity to spread the word. In terms of the potential relating to cuts in federal workforce, they say the president proposes and Congress disposes. So, the annual appropriations bill, the president could propose things in his budget request to Congress next year. But obviously, the final word is through Congress through the appropriations process. So,
Right.
Well, that's a good transition to our next question here. We do have a lot of our partners here on the call, and we really can't do this conservation work without our partners. Each of us has a really unique niche in the conservation space. There's so many ways you can take it, whether it's from the data science side, the advocacy side, legal, water quality, and the list goes on. But how can we work together as a coalition, groups of organizations, to have a loud, consistent message moving forward?
I
I You can take it or I can take it. I feel
go
comfortable
go
either way.
go for it, Mark. Go for it,
So
Mark.
I
Yeah.
think one is we need to work together. We need to convene. We need to have a united message before we start pushing things out there. I think there are a number of bodies within the watershed that convene from different perspectives that will be important towards promoting consistent messages. I think the Choose Clean Water Coalition does a phenomenal job. Dan talked about this already with that lobby day effort. I've participated every year for, I don't know, the past 5 years or so now. And it's always been incredibly, incredibly well organized. And I think you'd be amazed what kind of response you get from the congressmen and the senators when you show up in their office and you have a one-on-one conversation. It is really helpful. I think to that end, though, we have to be very clear about what our ask is. just going into the room and having the conversation when you don't have a clean ask is not quite as helpful. And I will say though, they have always been really helpful in boiling down the many things that we want into very finite and specific asks. I think those efforts also need to continue at the state level. States have played a really, 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 really important role towards some of the conservation efforts that we've talked about earlier, whether it be conservation or some of the restoration efforts that we've seen out of Pennsylvania and now Maryland. So, we'll have to work multiple channels, I think, if we want to see consistent progress. I wouldn't, although we're seeing some significant change at the federal level, I don't think that necessarily stops all the other efforts that we're pushing forward. I think, we should be thinking dynamically.
Yeah, I would just add one consistent message, and having been in conservation for 35 years, is the work that federal civil servants do day in, day out. They are the unsung heroes.
Mm.
The refuge manager, the biologist, the park ranger, the interpretive staff, the maintenance people at our national parks. Across the board, they are so invaluable. And this is that workforce, that skill set, that motivated people that knows this, that comes to work every day, thinking about, how can we serve the public? That is one of America's greatest treasures. And, I think as a conservationist, my recommendation would be, we need to do everything we can to preserve that knowledge, the institutional memory, the passion, the motivated workers through these very difficult times. And I think, many of these programs are partnerships with the states. And I think, the governors and the state agencies, ideally, they could chime in too, because without a strong federal partner, it's very difficult to achieve. In the funding, it's very difficult to achieve, the goals of the states and the federal agencies and the nonprofit partners. So.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
All right, one more question here. Do you feel that there's a clear understanding at the state and local level that conservation directly impacts climate change resiliency? Mark, do you want to take that?
I was going to give it to Dan.
Or Dan, feel free to jump in.
I think a lot of people recognize that the connection between conservation and climate change. Obviously, the science is there. I think more work needs to be done in terms of getting that message out. But as we see, the storm events and really dramatic things happening out there, the preserving the conservation landscape is a critical tool if we're going to succeed in the fight against climate change.
Yeah, I'll agree with you. I think the science is there. I think the science is indubitable. I would not say though that all of our elected officials at every level are fully briefed on the science. And
Right.
I think that's where it's incumbent upon us when having these conversations to explain, as much as we can, like how we understand how it works. And so I think the science is very strong there. The knowledge of the science is not necessarily so. And, we're going to have to do our work to make sure the right people understand why conservation is important. And I'll say this before you jump in, JT.
Sure.
I think giving people local examples is really, really, really important. I'll take one for Baltimore City. In Baltimore City, when we have significant rainstorms, certain areas in the city completely flood. Floating buses, floating cars. We have it happen, once or twice a year. And I think when you start to think about the impact of development and impervious surface and limited stormwater infrastructure, and not enough open space, that becomes part of the equation. And if we're able to articulate that in very simple terms, I think that can help people understand, how to think differently about development in the future, and even more where conservation makes the most sense. And we're already now in Baltimore having conversations about, conserving land along our streams and rivers that typically flood, knowing that that land is not really good for development. We know that we have that problem. Every time it rains, those places flood anyway. So we should not be putting buildings there. We should not leave that open. We should instead give them some space to breathe. So,
yeah, I think you bring up a good point that being able to make this information and our calls to action more consumable on the local level and applicable to the audiences, I think is going to carry a lot of weight. In particular, I think our work with Pennsylvania, it is not a bay
mhm,
state. It does not touch the Chesapeake Bay, yet it plays such a vital role in whole watershed conservation and water quality on the bay itself. But our team up in Pennsylvania, we have a team like this of 9 now, some of which are on this call.
mhm,
They're making the work that we're doing here in our calls to action on the state, the Commonwealth level,
mhm.
in line with maintaining farmland, maintaining the health of the Susquehanna River and the economy up there. So I think we should be meeting people where they are.
Yeah,
Certainly not disavowing our values and our goals for to mitigate the effects of climate change, but bring people along and making sure that because everyone comes into conservation in different ways,
right.
and we need to make sure that we're messaging to them and get them on board here because everyone has a stake in this.
Yeah, and to not to sound too cliche here, but we all know the saying that politics is local. I would suggest conservation is local too.
Yeah,
When we're doing efforts to clean up a stream and we want farmers to participate, just saying that it's helpful for farmers in Pennsylvania to clean up their farm so that we have a cleaner bay doesn't necessarily translate. But when you say that cleaning up your farm means that you can fish in your river, they get that. They get that, and they want to participate in that because it's local. So they're doing more of that, I think, for not just for the policy and the politics and the conversations that we're having about now, but even when it comes to the implementation of our work, talking about how the implementation of the stream restoration work or the conservation work for access to parks and lands, local access to parks and lands, I think is very compelling when it comes to getting people on your side and supporting the work that we do.
great, thanks. We'll wrap up in a second. Dan, Mark, do you have any closing remarks?
That's you, Dan.
I there was a email chat question. What have you seen regarding the latest proposals on federal workers? There was an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, Elon Musk, and I can't predict obviously the future. If you look in the past, in the previous Trump administration, they did propose what's called Schedule F, which is a really significant change in the federal workforce, the federal civil service. It would make it much easier to remove career workers. They also proposed relocating, for example, the Federal Bureau of Land Management and Interior Agency out to Colorado. So, we could see those types of things. But I would like to just close on a really positive message that, this is a very stressful time, obviously the transition, but having lived through it once, we if we work together and cross the aisle and highlight the benefits that this work has for families, for people, regardless of their party, we will be successful.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I won't suggest that this will not be a an interesting time for the work that we do. I will suggest though that we may need to think much more strategically about how we change how we talk about some of the work that we do. Once again, this is 100% a bipartisan issue. So we don't need to let politics have too much of an influence, although it may, but too much of an influence on our outcomes. A lot of the work that we're doing are in areas that really need the work. And I think those politicians want to see that effort happen. They want to see their districts do well. They want to see this conservation. They want to see these parks. And if we speak to the things that are local to their constituents and speak to the issues that that they also believe about. I think we can find ways to find consensus and collaborative ways to address some of the things we're working toward. It may mean that we talk about things differently, but I do think that tweaks in the way that we talk about some of our work can be helpful.
Great, thank you. So we'll close there. I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this. Also, a special shout out to our coalition partners and our public servants who were on the call. Thank you for the work that you're doing and dedicating your lives to this work. And I think the general message we have here is stay involved. I hearken back to the call from some of our Indigenous partners that this is to look 7 generations down the line. We need to, not necessarily focus on the next year or two. We need to think about what the future is going to hold. Conservation is big work. We have a lot of work to do. Stay engaged. That means we'll go out and volunteer, knock on doors to talk to people and get them involved in this work. Talk to your representatives. Make contributions. We're coming to the end of year giving. Love for contributions, not just the Chesapeake Conservancy, but all the other conservation organizations out there. You have some amazing small local conservation organizations in your community. Make gifts to them. A lot of them are struggling, and they're doing some amazing work on the ground. So there's many ways that you can make a difference here. Don't go anywhere. We're staying, we're keeping our heads focused on our main goal. We're going to send Dan off to go do more calls right now to Congress. So thank you so much once again, and hope you can join us for future webinars. Take care.
Thanks, JT.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, take care. Yeah, bye.